Are you somebody that can just dive in and figure things out as you go? Or do you tend to feel like you need to have things planned and figured out and know what the outcome is going to be before you allow yourself to dive into something? If you relate more to the latter, then today's video is definitely for you. Welcome. I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thank you for joining me. I'm doing this video because last week I was working on some designs for my Etsy shop, and I created one that basically is progress over perfection. And I think a lot of people can relate to that, but it really kind of made me think about the impact of perfection and what it does to us, and how we ultimately often end up becoming perfectionists. So today I want to talk a little bit about the idea of really allowing ourselves to accept it. I'm saying ourselves because I sometimes still need to be reminded of this, to allow ourselves to accept the reality, the truth, that progress is so much more important than perfection, in part because perfection doesn't exist. And if we continue to strive for something that doesn't exist, and we can never see ourselves as accomplished or successful or at a point in our journey until that time, we will never be able to get there. So I think first, start with identifying maybe where you do tend to fall. And if you're watching this and you are somebody that falls into that former category where you just dive in and don't really care about any of that other stuff, there might be some things that are important here for you as well. But thinking about how perfection shows up for you. What does it look like? How does it express itself? And that can certainly be around thoughts, reinforcing beliefs, like not being good enough and that sort of thing, comparing yourself to others. It certainly then impacts behavior and things that you decide to do or go after or not go after. It certainly affects your sense of self. There's a lot of ways that perfectionism contributes to reinforcing those core false beliefs. And I really do think that part of healing is getting to a place where we can recognize that it is the progress that is the healing. It is the progress that is what builds connection. The journey, the life journey, the healthy life journey happens within the progress. Because perfection doesn't exist, we will never get to experience that. And if we hold off or we put things off or beat ourselves up because we haven't met this unrealistic goal, then we can never feel fully whole or satisfied or happy or even really content for any lengthy period of time. So thinking about what does that look like for you? How does perfectionism show up for you? And you may not necessarily think about it as, I'm a perfectionist. That thought may not cross your mind. In fact, you may think you're the complete opposite of that because you're not perfect at anything. And maybe you don't even feel like you strive for perfection, so therefore you're not a perfectionist. Well, I can definitely relate to that because there was definitely a time that I would not have called myself a perfectionist because that would have seemed ludicrous because I didn't strive continuously for perfection. I didn't think about things in terms of it needs to be perfect. Like the idea of perfection or perfect wasn't something that necessarily crossed my mind, but I definitely lived from a place of things or myself needing to be right, like I needed to do things right, that if I couldn't do things well enough or good enough or perfect, that I shouldn't do them, or that I wasn't worthy of doing them. Depending on the circumstance, the thoughts might be different, but ultimately the idea is the same. But being able to recognize how the perfection shows up for you in terms of thoughts and behaviors and the impact that it has on you. Because when we strive, consciously or not, for perfection, or we think that everything has to be done just right, we end up holding ourselves back from so many things, oftentimes even including healing, certainly connecting, certainly healthy relationships, going after adventures or hobbies that we might enjoy, going after a career that we might prefer. So when you take some time to recognize, what does that really look like in your life? How does it play out? It can help you see the ways in which fear and perfectionism are holding you back. And from there, you can be very intentional about taking steps to help you get past that. And I think it is important to take a moment here to talk about where perfection comes from. Generally speaking, perfection comes from fear. It comes from fear about not being good enough. It comes from fear about being judged, being a failure, having those fears about being a failure being confirmed. Because if you don't get it exactly right, if it's not perfect, then everybody will know that you're not good enough, that you're a failure, or whatever it is that you're thinking to yourself. Fear is often what underlies perfection. And it definitely was for me, because I didn't want more evidence that I was terrible. No matter what area of life, I didn't need or want more evidence that I wasn't good enough. And I've talked about this briefly in regards to like when I went back to school and got my degree and everything, that I wasn't consciously aware at the time. I actually didn't recognize it until quite a few years later. But every semester I would plan, I would think, okay, this time it's going to be different. I'm going to get things prepared ahead of time, all that stuff. I had very good intentions. And then as soon as the semester would start, those intentions would go by the wayside and I would feel like a failure. But I recognized later that if I didn't try, then when I didn't do well, it's because I didn't try, not because I wasn't good, not because I wasn't good enough, not because I actually was not very smart. It was because I didn't try. And so that fear of failing, that idea of needing to be perfect, can look a lot of different ways, and it really can have an impact on our lives. Fortunately for me, the most impact that had was just really stressing me out. I would end up staying up the night before till whatever time to get a 20-page paper done. And I ended up doing fairly well, but it constantly kept me in a state of not only stress, but stuck in the idea that I wasn't good enough. I wasn't smart. And I know that so many of you can relate to that in a number of ways. Maybe it's not specifically about being smart or not being good enough in terms of being able to do the work, that work in particular, schoolwork. But in various ways it can show up. Another way that it showed up for me that I had no idea was related to perfection, because it was so completely the opposite of what perfection seemed to be. And that was how I thought about cleaning in particular. And I think I have shared this before as well. But it's still kind of, when I think about it, it still just kind of amazes me that in my mind it seemed to make complete sense. But this wasn't always the case. But I would sometimes feel overwhelmed by cleaning because I tended to think of cleaning as very all or nothing. Not all the time, and most of the time it wasn't all or nothing. But there were a lot of times that I would think about, okay, I need to clean the kitchen, for example. And I would end up feeling so overwhelmed by it that I just felt completely depleted and had no energy and no desire to do it. I wouldn't do it, and then I would feel bad about not doing it. I would tell myself how lazy I was, how bad I was, how bad of a mom or a wife I was, or whatever. I would come up with all kinds of things. And I remember very distinctly one time, and I think this is where the awareness kind of began. I found myself thinking about cleaning the kitchen, and in all reality, that really could have meant getting the dishes done, cleaning the counter, and cleaning off the stove. Like, that could have been it. But in my mind at that particular time, for whatever reason, very consciously, I remember having the thought, oh, well, I need to pull out the stove. If I'm going to clean the stove, I need to pull the stove out. And then I really need to pull out the refrigerator. And I need to be able to do that. And I just didn't have the inclination. I had no desire to do that. I might have had the time to do it, but I felt like I didn't have the time to do it because it seemed like it was going to take forever and be so much work. And because I didn't have the ability to take the refrigerator and the stove out and clean behind them and clean them all really well, then therefore I couldn't clean the kitchen. Because if I cleaned just those few things and not the whole kitchen, then it wasn't good enough. So therefore I just wasn't going to do it, which then made me feel horrible, right? So it may not be cleaning a kitchen, but you can probably see some similarities about how you might tend to think of some things in regards to getting it right, or having it need to be a certain way, or completely through something from start to finish in order for it to be enough. And I think that that's one of the most significant things that I wanted to really emphasize here is progress, right? So I talk all the time about healing is a process, right? There are a lot of different pieces that go into it. Things have to happen kind of subsequently. We need steps that we have to kind of go through. We may go and take those steps again, but there are different things, different experiences that we need to be able to have. And that is the process. And so often when it comes to healing, or I guess even a lot of other things, but in particular when it comes to healing, people will look at the end goal is, okay, now I'm healing, or now I've healed. But all this other stuff leading up to that doesn't count. And if I have an off day, if I have a day when I'm not able to talk myself through something, if I have a day when I kind of go back on my boundaries, then I have to start at the beginning, and none of what I've been doing really matters. And that is not the case. Every day is progress. Every day that you have a moment of awareness, even if you have several when you're not so aware, but you have a moment of awareness. Every day that you honor yourself in some way, every day that you intentionally take care of yourself, every day that you do something intentional to work on healing, every time that you read something or watch something. Each of those things counts as both progress and the process. And the process, all the pieces of your progress lead you to where you ultimately desire and deserve to be. And every step, from the very first step that you took, you are making progress. And if you think of healing, if you think of mental wellness or emotional wellness as perfection, or even the path, the journey to get there, having to look a specific way or feel a specific way, you're going to constantly feel like you are failing. You're going to find things in your likely everyday life that you can point to that would suggest that today was a failure and now you have to start over tomorrow. But that is not the reality. Every day is a day of progress. And progress matters so much more than not only perfection, because perfection isn't real, but progress matters so much more than the idea of being able to get to a place where nothing ever bothers you, where you never struggle again. Because if anybody ever gets to a place where they never struggle again or nothing ever bothers them, that would concern me. It would mean to me that they're likely shut off a little bit in some capacity. Because life, relationships, there's ups and downs, often. And depending on all kinds of things that are going on, those ups and downs are going to feel different. Sometimes a little bit more extreme in both the up and the down potentially. Healing happens in the progress that we make day to day. Even when it feels like we're not moving up that mountain, doing things to stay where you are, that is progress. Or, you know that I don't believe in taking steps back in healing, but even if you feel like you've slid back a little bit and you're working your way back to where you were, that is progress, right? Because when you have your times when you find yourself struggling more and you have to work at getting through that, that work that you're doing is part of the healing. And you have to do that work over and over again in order to continue to make progress. You don't do the work one time and that's it. And I've talked about this before in regards to like, I don't know, I can't think of a specific example right now, but like in setting a boundary, right? Like you might have days when you're pretty good at being able to recognize what you want and being able to set that boundary. But then there might be a day in which somebody really pushes back against your boundary and you find that you kind of let that boundary go for that moment, and you end up doing something that you don't really want to do. And you'll feel like all the work that you've done wasn't really all that healing. It didn't really matter, that you're not really healing because here you are. But healing requires practice, right? And the practice is in part practicing things that you've already done before, right? When you're practicing learning an instrument, you don't just play a note once and then you always get it right. You have to keep practicing that note over and over and over again. And sometimes you get it right and it's great. Sometimes you really miss it. But that doesn't mean that you can't play. It doesn't mean that all the practicing that you've done to be able to have this one time that you played it masterfully doesn't mean that that doesn't exist. It means that you keep practicing so that you can have more days in which you hit the note right and well every time, with just an occasional time that you miss it. So much of healing is very much the same. In the example of the boundary, when you don't enforce the boundary and you're feeling bad about it, as you work through what happened to make you not hold that boundary, what feelings came up, what reality testing can you do so that you can feel more confident and trust in yourself? Recognizing that you can get through that and set a boundary again helps you recognize that you do have the ability to do that. So there's a lot of learning, there's a lot of practicing and experiencing that strengthens that piece of the foundation to continue to build upon, to create stronger boundaries, maybe more boundaries. And all of that is really, really important progress. So when you find yourself thinking about doubting yourself, questioning yourself, whether it's about this healing journey or really any aspect of life, whatever it might be, in your work life, in your romantic life, in your friendships, in your hobbies, whatever it is, when you recognize that you have these ideas of the way it should be, the way that you should be, the way it ultimately needs to look in order for you to be successful at it, or for you to be able to feel okay about it and not see it as a complete failure. Recognizing what those things are so that you can take a step back and think about all the steps that it took to get to wherever it is that you landed. Because every step is a point of progress. And everything that we ultimately want for ourselves and in our lives, it happens with progress over time. Whether that is like mastering a hobby, being able to get to a place where we just really enjoy it and don't get caught up in technique or getting things wrong, when we can just be in it and enjoy it. That doesn't just happen. You don't just decide to start this new hobby and suddenly you're there. It takes progress, and not just the practicing to get there. It takes experience over time, which I guess is kind of practicing, but each step of the way is progress toward getting to a place where you just naturally feel some of that. And that is definitely true when it comes to healing. There is no failure when it comes to healing. Yes, you may revert back to old coping mechanisms. You may revert back to old beliefs. You may find yourself reverting on those boundaries. But none of that is a failure. None of that has anything to do with your ability to ultimately get to where you want to be. It is part of the process, and working through that is progress. And that's really what matters. And I've said this to people over the years, and I've maybe even said it in videos, but you will continue to make progress as long as you do not give up. And that is really critically important. As long as you do not give up, as long as you don't give in to the fear that you cannot heal, as long as you stay engaged with yourself, you will continue to see progress. Yes, you have to stay engaged. It isn't just going to magically happen. But as long as you stay engaged in the process, you will continue to see progress. And that is absolutely true for healing, but I think that that's really pretty true in a lot of areas of life. So keep in mind, maybe write it on a Post-it note if you need to for a while. Progress over perfection. I think it's a really simple, maybe even think of it as a mantra. to have in the back of your mind progress over perfection in all areas of life, but especially when it comes to healing, and being mindful of how you're speaking to yourself through that. Progress over perfection. Thanks so much for being here. I'd love to hear from you. Share what came up for you in the comments. I'll look forward to seeing you next time.